This is our second year talking about export control, and we have a few more faces in the audience.
Couple.
I wonder why. Why do you think that is, Ryan?
Something happened last week.
What happened?
So I think first off, hello everyone, thanks for joining us. I think it's one really exciting time to be here. Obviously it's the third Quantum World Congress. We've done this session now at every Quantum World Congress. In the last 2 years it's been the U.S. is about to implement export controls. The U.S. is about to have PQC NIST standards finalized. The U.S. government is about to announce some really large funding programs from DARPA, from DOE. All of those things have occurred really in the last month or two. It's been an incredibly productive time from the U.S. government, and some clarity regarding policy has really come out in the last 2 months. So we're excited to get some details about that, provide some predictions, and then answer some questions at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we go too far, I kind of like to start to just level set with folks. You know, for folks who don't know me, well, we're both lawyers. And I know sometimes people are like, why are lawyers showing up to a quantum conference? For me, I've been in the field for about 7-ish years or so, transferring over from being a federal attorney. And very early on, I started to hear this idea of export. And I was like, what are you talking about? What are we exporting? What does this mean? This isn't a commercial field. And over time, I started to kind of appreciate there's a lot of nuances with export control. And so I will just start out and give a little bit of background. So typically, when you think of export, you think of taking a product and moving it from one country to another. That is kind of your very traditional product export control. There's also technology export or technology transfer, moving that technological know-how, whatever that thing happens to be, the data, and moving it between one country to another. That's where things start to get a little bit more complex. So in this field, starting in around 2018, 2019, maybe even earlier, I'm kind of looking around at some of the folks who've been in it for a while and heard about it, we were hearing things about the US government wanting to control quantum. We had heard 50 qubits, we had heard 200 qubits. That was actually when I think a lot of the industry was like, hold on, what do you mean you want to control a hardware system at 200 qubits? What does that mean? Are we talking addressable qubits? What are the fidelities? Like, what is this? What does it mean? What does it mean when we are still doing, essentially, so several years ago, fundamental research? How is that going to be applicable? What does this mean for the industry? And so a group of companies started talking through this and trying to have outreach with the government. And I would say, I think the government was very, very receptive to hear what we had to say. Didn't always agree with what we had to say, but they listened. And I think at this point, what we will talk about soon, which is what came out last week, is a fairly balanced, albeit still maybe a little premature, but a fairly balanced view of export control. So what are some of the principles? So for those of you who are not from the United States, we have a very unique rule here called a deemed export. And this is where things start to get complex. So what a deemed export is, right, because you have the transfer of the product between nations, you have the transfer of technology between nations, those are pretty simple. This one is where you have a non-US citizen or a non-US person. If you're like, oh, legal, why are you drawing the distinction? A US person is going to be someone with a green card, things like that, right? Asylum seekers, there's the special category. But when you have individuals who are foreign nationals working in your US company and you share this controlled technology with them, that is deemed, that is considered to be an export to that individual's home country. That's where things start to get a bit complex. As many of you know, this is a very international field with a very international diverse workforce. And lots of people are coming from around the world to study this field. And so a lot of companies had a lot of concerns about how much this type of export would stifle innovation and would stifle the ability to be able to transfer this knowledge back and forth, and at what times it would be triggered. So before I go any further, Ryan, do you want to kind of walk through what has had the specifics of the regulations?
Sure. So over the summer, basically since April or May, we've seen numerous U.S. allies roll out their own export controls. There were some interesting press articles over the summer being like, why are all of these random countries coming out with the same identical, or at least materially identical, export controls? So what has happened, and what the U.S. released last Thursday, September 5th, is a coordinated means of creating a new scheme for export controls for quantum. If you're familiar with export controls, there's something called the Wassenaar Arrangement, where 42 different countries would create a scheme for export controls and allowing them to trade with one another under some set rules. That agreement has essentially been dead since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. And so they've had to find new ways, basically, to have multilateral agreements. And so we've seen over the last 4 months, numerous U.S. allies across Europe. We've seen UK, France, Netherlands, Canada, Japan, and a few other U.S. allies all release these export controls. And what they do is create a sliding scale of what is controlled based on both physical qubits and the C0 error rate. And so this has been, again, this is a 2+ year conversation that industry has been having, both with the U.S. government, the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, as well as foreign governments and their trade representatives as well. And so the resulting sliding scale with both physical qubits and C0 error rate is a lot better than what was originally proposed, as Kaniah mentioned, where it's going to be 200 qubits, we don't care about fidelity, hard stop there, which would have been extremely restrictive and also not particularly helpful. As we know from this conference, physical qubit number is not always the best, or hardly ever the best, measure of the power of a quantum computer. So what came out last week, also from the U.S. government side, included 2 very important exceptions. One of them is a limited license exception that allows the U.S. to export with countries that have materially similar controls and share U.S. values. So obviously that's kind of diplomatic speak, but it means if allies have put in these similar export controls, you can trade with them, you can export there without a license requirement. That's huge. That is basically Wassenaar minus Russia, and we will see, I think, in the next few months, more U.S. allies roll this out. Secondly, to Kaniah's point about workforce, these controls included a deemed export exclusion with a very limited compliance obligation, where U.S. countries or U.S. companies basically just have to tell the U.S. government which foreign nationals work for them and the extent of their work with controlled quantum computers and related hardware and software. So this is great. It shows that, one, BIS was really listening to industry feedback. It shows organizations like the QEDC are doing amazing work. The government is partnering with them, and that we're building as this section is called, a pro-innovation regulatory environment. Obviously, you can quibble about the numbers. You can quibble about maybe these should have come out a little bit later. But all in all, I think this is a very balanced approach, and most importantly, it recognizes the U.S. cannot go it alone. There are not enough quantum physicists, engineers, the people who build, run, and iterate these machines in the United States. And having that kind of restriction would be devastating to our companies, and it would be devastating to the U.S.'s leadership in quantum. And so we're very pleased with the balanced nature of these export controls. And it's great to have them out. It puts a level playing field out there, and it provides real clarity to both U.S. companies and foreign companies in this field.
And for those of you who are technical, without going too much further, I can give you the first 2. I don't know if you have the full list, but where this starts to come into play are for hardware systems that have between 32 and 100 qubits with a C0 error of 10 to the minus 4, and 100 qubits to 200 qubits with a C0 error of 10 to the minus 3. Now, it'll be interesting to see which companies start to have these regimes come into play. I would predict it's much more likely that these regimes will become important right now for those companies that are working in the supply chain that are currently in development. So for those who don't know, this is hardware. It's a very brittle supply chain, meaning that there's very few suppliers who depending on the component parts that you need, but regardless of the modality you're talking about, there are certain important parts that go into these systems that come from overseas. So historically, most, although not all, modalities have, for the most part, had COTS type items. That means commercial off the shelf, to the extent any of these items are commercial. So I'll talk about ion trapping. A lot of the lasers that we use for our system, we've gotten from overseas. The dilution refrigerators that superconducting systems use typically come from overseas. And they have been somewhat static-ish for a while based on the needs of academia. And you're starting to see some changes. In fact, as these systems are starting to scale, to change fundamentally from where they had started maybe 10, 15 years ago, whatever the particular modality, has come from. Each of them are starting to scale, and they're scaling rapidly. And so where I think you're going to see a lot of impact is going to be in those modalities that need to be partnering with their key suppliers who are not in the United States, who have to start working together to figure out how to scale whatever the particular thing that it needs to do can be done. So just predicting the near-term future, I would suggest that is where we are going to see the nearest impact. That being said, I think you're also, as you look internationally, you're starting to see more and more countries put aside investment dollars to create or bring quantum computers, hardware, into their jurisdiction. So if they happen to have a domestic company that they can invest in that they're able to build and use those systems, great. But for those that don't, there's going to be many companies that have opportunities to ship their systems into these various jurisdictions. It'll be interesting to see when these standards start to take effect and when these systems do require licenses. So that I would predict that would be a little bit further out. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right, and it will be interesting to see, one, when the technology is actually developed that we actually have real controlled computers in a way that we don't currently, given where the systems are at. Which countries roll out these materially similar controls such that you can have the limited license exception. And I would like to throw out one thing that came up on Monday, I believe, during the international forum, and it's this idea of taking this regime as it continues to develop and possibly creating a free trade zone around quantum. And so you basically have U.S. allies creating a free trade zone for quantum computing, allowing for the export of quantum computers, hardware, software, as well as an ease of flow both of materials and of people, so it would have an immigration and workforce effect as well. That was thrown out a couple times during the international forum. I think it's a really interesting idea and one where this framework can potentially be iterated and expanded upon if there is continued international agreement, and as a way to, from a national security standpoint, to folks, especially in the defense community, counter a rising China, a China that has spent between 15 and 20 billion on quantum, with a association of free countries who are building quantum computers, exchanging idea, transferring IP, and allowing immigration to flow between them. So we'll see how that develops.
Yeah, I agree. We can go on a little bit. This room is not exactly conducive for questions, but we did want to give the opportunity to ask questions. So I can certainly apparently walk around with the mic since I came in a little late. But I would like to also mention one other aspect, because I think we've heard this a bit tying to quantum. When you talk about these export regulations, what's kind of driving a lot of this is the idea of keeping a domestic supply and workforce and keeping technology domestic. One of the things that we've heard paired with investment in quantum is the CHIPS Act. Do you want to talk through the CHIPS Act a little bit and how we've seen it kind of adjacently touch on some of these issues?
Sure, I think, pivoting to USG funding, I think is probably the easiest next step to talk about. And just starting the conversation, I think it's interesting to look at, with the export controls having now dropped, it shows that the U.S. government is inherently acknowledging the power of quantum computing, both for national security and economic security. And it means we're coming out of an age of fundamental research trying to push towards commercialization. Obviously, we've heard a lot of different terms used for that over the last couple of days, whether that's scientific quantum advantage, quantum supremacy, what have you. All of us are moving in the same direction of we want to build useful machines. And so with these export controls, it shows that we're moving beyond this era of fundamental research. And so that being said, the US government, whether through the CHIPS Act, whether through some of these new programs through DARPA, through the DOE, has got to continue to fund, expand funding, and have more strategic, aligned funding and programs with specific KPIs, such that we're not funding it as fundamental research with a little bit of money dispersed to a bunch of different organizations, and we're actually building domestic capacity and helping companies move out of the valley of death towards commercialization in a way where we're building machines that are useful both for the US government and for commercial industry as well. And I think the CHIPS Act is probably a good place to start for that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what's interesting about chips, so if you're not familiar, it's really a little bit more focused on semiconductor and re-domiciling the know-how, the fabrication facilities for semiconductors. And I think it was, do you remember the number that came out of chips? 260 billion? I don't know.
280 billion.
280 billion, which is no small chunk of change, right? That's a lot of money. It's also not nearly enough to actually accomplish what it is we need to do. I've heard estimates that it's roughly closer to 1.2 trillion that we need, if not more. And why is that? Because when you build a facility, when you have manufacturing, when you're running these things, you have a bunch of machines, you have a bunch of know-how that go into these machines. You have to turn knobs, you have a lot of training, you have a lot of process you develop. And so with this money, you have to kind of start from scratch in some cases. And in some cases not, you can refurbish these facilities, but there's a lot of money and machinery and knowledge and know-how that go into the creation of this. Why is this important? Well, for us and other systems, we in quantum need our traps, our chips, and other things to touch these foundries. And so thinking about the workforce that's being directed to semiconductor, thinking about the machines and the other things that are kind of being directed in here, and the amount of time it takes to actually re-domesticate this skill set and this, the ability to do some of these things just for semiconductors, right? Putting aside quantum for a second, that's a lot of time. What does it mean for a nascent industry like us that's beginning to scale? Well, it means there's going to be a lot more work happening in other locations around the world, which again is why these become so important in understanding that we have a similar regime around like-minded countries so that we can continue to work with partners that maybe don't exist in the United States and that we can't wait to get up to speed in the United States. We have to be able to leverage some of these other places, if you're using a fabrication facility or some other thing to be able to create these parts now, right? The quantum community, the ion trapping community cannot wait 7 years for a fab facility to get up to speed. So having at least some standard and understanding a framework that we're dealing with becomes at least not only a level playing field, but it helps companies understand what they need to do to be able to work with the US government to either get the approvals that are needed or to be able to ship whatever they need overseas to be able to get this work done. So all in all, that's why I said as much as I would love to see no regime right now, because it is still a nascent industry, having a framework that we can all work under at least helps companies understand what they need to do. Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think not as much on the regulatory side, but just purely on the funding side and thinking about domestic and industrial policy. The CHIPS Act is obviously an amazing starting point and was one of the most important pieces of legislation we've seen in a long time in terms of building U.S. capacity for semiconductors and building a great start for quantum. There's some great language and money in chips for quantum networking, for quantum education, building the directorate at NSF, and more. But there's also a sense, we spent a lot of time on the Hill, of, well, what more do you want? We already passed $282 billion. Chip, we're bringing semiconductors back. That we have language about quantum, like, we're done. And that for anyone in the quantum industry understands, these machines are incredibly expensive, difficult to build, and require the smartest people in the world to be employed at our companies to build them. And so domestic policy cannot end with chips. And having that conversation about a very opaque, difficult topic as quantum, and building a long-term, long horizon, but also very high rate of return, long-term, is a tough policy conversation. And it's one where I think the US government is really sending signals, especially the last 3 or 4 months, as we mentioned, about how we're going to fund it. And I think the DARPA quantum benchmarking initiative that was announced 2 weeks ago now is extremely important way to do that. It's a 9-year program with 3 separate phases, each of which have very specific KPIs, measures for companies to meet, and a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow where if you continue to meet the measures that the government sets, you will be incentivized through payments, and at the end, you will get a stamp of approval from DARPA and from the US government that your machine is up to standards and you're helping to build use cases that are relevant to the US government. I think that is extremely, extremely important because we need domestic policy that is focused, and companies need to be incentivized to work with the US government. There's been a lot of very interesting conversation at this conference in terms of government folks, both from the US government and international, saying, we don't care that you're bringing us solutions that are sexy just because they're quantum. We have problems, whether those are across the government or military problems. We need solutions, and whether those solutions are hybrid, quantum plus AI, quantum plus high performance computing, help us build solutions to these problems with what you're offering. And so incentivizing that co-design and helping companies have steps to build, to hit, and then to achieve that funding is going to be crucial for us. Getting through the valley of death as companies, but crucial to the United States in terms of building quantum industrial policy over the next 10 years and retaining that leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 8 minutes left. I do want to give folks the opportunity to ask questions. I know this is a challenging thing, but one thing I would encourage, especially for those of you who are lawyers, please, I would ask, continue to learn, if you don't already know, just about some of this technology so you have a good understanding. And for those of you who are technical experts, and I have to give Dr. Robert Souter some credit, he has done this for a long time, which is be sure you can talk to the regulators and the policymakers, because this is such an important area, and being able to understand something as fundamental as 32 qubits at a C-naught error of 10 to the minus 4, and what that translates to is an important conversation to be having with these regulators. The innovation period right now, as Ryan mentioned, this TRL level of 4, 5, 6, right? This winter, the time when a lot of technologies have a difficult time coming through to a true commercialization. It's just absolutely critical to continue to have this dialogue and to continue to encourage policymakers and regulators to be mindful of the challenges that companies face. This is not to say, and by the way, I've heard this a lot, which is the government's not here to pick winners and losers, and that's not at all what we're suggesting. It is, however, important to work with where industry is today, to learn where industry is today, and to understand and help industry understand. Because the other thing I'd mention is when you look across the sector, you tend to look at the very, very large companies like IBM and Microsoft and AWS, and certainly for us, Honeywell. When you have large companies, they have the infrastructure to manage all of these, how to operate with regulation. When you're talking about small companies and startups, many small companies don't have attorneys. They don't have the infrastructure, the back offices to be able to manage the amount of paperwork that's required to go and seek licenses. They don't necessarily understand all of the things that they have to have in place. And they're very fearful of, obviously nobody wants to break the law. So understanding kind of where that industry is and having the ability to work together and create things like a free trade zone that's less complex is really, really critical to continue that innovation.
Before we move into questions, I do want to highlight one more thing in terms of just so much has happened from the U.S. government just the last month alone. And for anyone who watched the debate last night, VP Harris actually mentioned quantum computing in terms of the U.S. needs to win the race for both AI and quantum computing. That seems like, just a little throwaway line. That's incredibly, incredibly important that quantum computing has entered the mainstream in that way. For anyone who works in this industry, you probably got some text last night of, oh, they said the word quantum computing. That's huge. And the fact that that is now not just a random word on the Hill, but something that even if there's not deep, deep expertise, policymakers know about. President Trump signed the National Quantum Initiative Act in 2018. VP Harris actually authored a bill that was kind of a predecessor to what became the NQIA when she was a senator. And so both campaigns are well aware of what quantum computing is, the importance for national security and economic security, and being able to build upon that with policymakers, create domestic policy, and advance pro-innovation regulatory structures is going to be incredibly important. So we've got about 4.5 minutes. I think we can.
And yeah, I wanted to ask the first question, but really picking up on Kaniah, what you just said. Even Quantinuum is a big startup. You have the resources, tremendous legal, regulatory experience and expertise with you. I know a lot of small startups, and there are hundreds of startups in quantum, many of them really just a handful of people, right, that, okay, learn about it, but is there anything that folks can do proactively to influence regulatory environments that actually foster innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, if you haven't, please join, if you are in the US, the QEDC, the Quantum Economic Development Consortium, the QIC, which I can't remember, the Quantum Industrial, help me, Coalition. Sorry, Paul Steimers, wherever you happen to be. Get involved in the organizations that offer these types of services. So I hired Ryan. I met Ryan through the QEDC. They had just formed the Law Technical Advisory Committee, and one of the things we tried to do is make this type of knowledge open for companies. I know ASTAR in Japan, other European organizations, there's coalitions forming. Talk to them and encourage them to help you understand what you can do within your own framework. There are typically rules in various countries as to how you approach regulators and lawmakers, and it can also be complex because, lawyers wrote this, so we did it to be complex. But join these organizations and take advantage of really what is still a very open community right now, and those people who want to help and feel passionate about. I have found that in large companies, in small companies, and all across the board. And yes, talk to your policymakers. Invite them. If you have people will know, I'm always like, hey, come see our system. Look at our system. This is a quantum computer. Did you know this is what it looks like? It's very big, isn't it? It doesn't look like the pretty gold chandelier that you see at IBM. Ours looks very different. Go look at what these things look like. Understand, because when you can walk into a room and see that, an ion trapping system may take up, a 5x12 table with hundreds of wires hanging there and tons of lasers and optics, and you're like, wow, that looks different than what I thought it did. You also start to appreciate what the supply chain begins to look like, and you can kind of piece this together. So I would say absolutely talk to your coalitions and start talking to the right people to help educate what this technology is.
We have time for one question. Should folks talk to their local lawmakers, stakeholders?
I would encourage them to, yes. Typically, your lawmaker and regulator should know what they can and can't do, and they should tell you that. I was an ethics attorney for a number of years, so they will tell you that. I did see a question, but talk to them. Talk to them about what you know and find a way to try and demystify some of the complexity.
Hi, thank you very much. Jonathan Lee Smith from UK Quantum, which is the industry association in the UK. I'm reaffirming a point you've made, as I didn't see questions. You really must engage with your local institutions. Many companies have international bases. We saw these regulations drop, of course, before the summer, and so we had a pass. After some feedback, we saw the introduction of an open general export license, which allowed the free trade. I'm glad that it all happened at the same time for you. We had a week or so of discussion. But it's important that industry talks together and consistently through every level. This is a multilateral discussion between our respective governments. If industry can pull together its voice and feed in through all of them, we have a far better chance of not tripping over ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I will say, I had a brief moment of panic for about a week trying to figure out if we could, because almost half of our scientists are in the UK, and I had this moment of, oh my gosh, are we going to get in trouble with the UK government because we can't even, the stuff that we're doing here in the US, if we send it over there, can we actually have them talk back to our US employees? The answer is yes. But these are complex issues, and there's a lot of ways to trip up. So totally agree with you. It's, this can get really, really hard, but working together and working with your folks to help make this as easy as possible, definitely do so.
Good. Thank you so much. Impressive work. Thank you for that work. And Ryan, thank you for bringing ties to Quantum Tech conferences. I don't need to go shopping.
You know how lawyers are.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. Thank you, everybody.